Hello, team. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the Coffee with Prab. And today we have Mr. Bevin Lane, the director of InfoSec Consulting, 30 plus year of experience. I repeat, 30 plus year of experience in the information security, risk management consulting, work for Big Four, and what a pleasure for us to have Mr. Bevin in this session. And I'm sure in this session, Mr. Bevin is going to discuss about how to conduct a risk assessment in the organization. They're going to share the experience, the mistakes, myths about risk assessment, how the risk assessment works in the organization, mistakes that you can avoid. And I'm sure that will be a fruitful session, and we can expect more and more, pointers from Mr. Bevin on this particular session. And I'm sure this video will be useful for all the aspirants who are basically making their career in consulting. Thank you, Mr. Bevin, for your time. And I know it's a Friday and it is a time for a party there, but thanks for giving us this
Good for
opportunity,
you,
Mr.
yeah.
Bevin.
You should be sleeping. At least I'm finishing up my day. Thank you very
But
much.
I'm really obliged that you're able to give us time for this session. Knowledge is something which it's a noble cause. Training is something, or learning is something, is a noble cause, and you are here for serving you're giving back to the community of information security and consulting. It is really a great feeling for me also that that you're able to sharing your experience in this session. Thanks, Mr. Bevin.
Pleasure. I mean, I think the day today has been a lot of those sort of sessions. And what I found again is just I had a chat to somebody from Australia this morning. Then I chatted to someone from South Africa who also was starting a new company, and she was asking me for advice on risk management. And I think it's so amazing. Both those people, the thing on risk came up. And you said to me on this topic, what do you think? And I thought, great, this is a brilliant topic because risk management is something where it comes up every day of my life. And if you think about all of us, we're thinking about risk all the time. No matter what you're doing, we're thinking about it. Risk to our money. Look what's happening in the world today. We're looking at risk to the companies we're working, risk to our clients. So risk is the dominant thing, risk to our families. Everything about the world is risk. And when I do risk assessment courses, the first trick is really to try and do that, bring that to people personal. What is risk to you? And then you start to understand how risk fits into the big scheme of what we're doing in information security. If you can start to relate back to yourself.
Great. And Mr. Bevin, you're already running a company, I think, right? You are the director of InfoSec Consulting. Could you please help me about, what this company is all about? What is their contribution to the information security?
So the company, I'm funny enough starting a second branch of it right now in the UK. So I'm sitting in the UK right now, which is why the first branch is from South Africa. And because of how much we've grown in the last 3 or 4 years and the demand in terms of assurance services, risk consulting services, and those sort of things, we're growing now into a second division. So our main focus is on putting frameworks into place in companies. So looking at a company that needs to become ISO 27001 certified, possibly we do a lot of work with PCR type services as well. So a lot of assessment services, and then implementation and growing a security function in a company with these type of advisory services. We do audits, we do assessments, we do training, we do consulting on specific issues. So even including things like the ISF framework as well. But the specific issues we'll do is when someone will say to us, we've got a problem with our security architecture. Can you come in and give us pointers on how to bring it to the new, where the new risks are coming, the new threats are coming. So a lot of different type of stuff, which is great.
That's really great. That's really a great information. Thanks, Mr. Bevin. Bevin, this is always a query. Most of the participants, I always receive this DM, and I'm sure you also receive a lot of requests on LinkedIn or on your personal account that how we conduct a risk assessment in the organization, because different framework talk about different way to conduct a risk. So from a practicality point of view, if we are a consultant and we would like to drive risk assessment in the organization, what is the first step? What is the last step? Could you please help us with those things?
Okay, great. So Yeah, as you said, there are a lot of approaches out there, and obviously not one approach is right or maybe necessarily better than another approach. It what fits for a company, and some of the big globals you can imagine have got these hectic tools with all these extra things in them that you implement that are massive and link into business processes and link into what the company is trying to do, and then have all the different areas covered. So when you're looking at a smaller company and you don't necessarily have access to tools, a lot of times we still do it the old-fashioned way with spreadsheets. And there is a very good solution for doing a technical type of risk assessment where you can go back and use the NIST approaches, and the NIST approaches have got one where they link it back to technical threats, and very good at that sort of side of it. And so the approach we use is we understand what the client wants first. What is the scope of a risk assessment? And that's your first question. What are we trying to do with the scope of a risk assessment? If it is going to be a technical one about what the threats are in terms of our web app, what are we looking, how are we trying to protect our web application? Then we'll go and use a lot of those things that you can get from the NIST methodologies. And there it's talking about threat trees, and it's talking about protecting your overall web application or your technical infrastructure, your network, your firewalls. Those are the approaches we tend to do when we do those ones.
So when you conduct a risk assessment, Mr. Bevan, like, when you start your first step, as you said, scoping is very important. So what is the ideal person we need to approach in the organization, which can provide us information about the organization?
So when you, the first question is really what the objective is about the risk assessment, and that will then be, when you get that answer about what the objective of the risk assessment, that person that you're speaking to ideally is the person who's going to give you those answers. If you don't have the person says, we need a risk assessment, we don't know where to start, then it's still driven by the scope. So if the scope is a technical one, you're going to go speak to the IT, the developers, the management of that system. If it is not, if it is more of a governance, overall ISO 27001 type of risk assessment, you're probably going to have to go to sometimes even the CEO of a company and ask him about what you can get in terms of the information that you need for your ISO, your ISMS type of risk assessment. So there's a couple of different trees and ways of doing this depending on what the scope is, but sometimes we do talk directly to the CEO and that sort of level. Other times we're talking much lower to the IT management level.
So, Mr. Bevan, like, while gathering this information in the risk assessment, the first step is risk identification. We're talking about inventory of assets and vulnerability threats. So, have you ever faced any challenge while gathering this information, or any issues which always a consultant face while they collecting these information? Because initial information is very important information to build a solid baseline or solid foundation. So, do you ever face any kind of issues or challenge while gathering this information from the stakeholders, customers, clients, or whatever?
Yes, you of course. I think that would be the answer, wouldn't it? In some cases, what we find is there is nothing that they've done yet. They don't have an understanding of their business processes and their assets. They don't actually they haven't started. They've always thought about risk as being like for the whole company, and then they deal with it as one big thing. They don't understand information assets. They don't understand business processes. So often that is a challenge that you're faced. In some companies, it might be really difficult when you're dealing with a big company that have done this for business continuity, for example, but have not done it across the company and don't have a full set of information assets or the critical information assets. So for a smaller company, they tend to have not done this because they don't really understand risks, they don't understand business processes in a more formal way. But at least with a small company, it's quite easy, because then you can actually start the discussion just with almost an hour discussion. What is your business? What do you do? How do you make money? What are your critical issues that you face? And come up with a list of information assets and business processes very quickly, which is actually good fun, because you find out about a company and what its critical drivers are pretty quickly.
Fine. So this is a very good information. The last point, what you said about the business revenue. This is, I think, some consultant use. They always, you know, messed up with this information, because when they go by any book and all that, they say identify assets. It's all about web server, data center, and all that. But the real thing, what we say here, is business process. You need to know the value of the business, how the business generating a revenue. Because by end of the day, if you're identifying some gaps, you need to fill those gaps. You need to address those gaps with some controls, and controls required investment. So what sort of documents we used to collect, when you're going for the initial phase where you're gathering information? Okay, we're talking about business process. Like, what are the other documents you would like to suggest to a consultant when they want to drive the risk assessment in the organization?
So the easiest way is when people have done, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, the business continuity documentation, because you should have already understood what the critical things are to the company. So if our sales process, how we bill our clients, if those sort of processes go down, how much does it cost our company? So those are critical processes. You would have evaluated the processes, you would have looked at how much money you're going to lose, and you would have looked at the risks related to it. So business continuity is a very good place. The other place are when you're looking in your financial systems, you'd look to see what your financial processes are that are critical to the business. Sometimes technical processes, by looking in your technical supporting documentation. What do we do as a business? How do we make money? We develop bespoke products for our company. This is how we generate revenue, for example. And then you look at those technical supporting documents in order to find the business processes. Those are probably three very good places to start.
That is really excellent, and I'm also noting down those points, because I will add that in a video summary. Might be it can be useful for the future aspirants. So now we have collected the information, like we collected the business process, we understand the financial information. Then what is the next step, Mr. Bivin, after that?
Once you've got that information on what those critical business processes are, and you've understood how they fit together, what you can do is you can actually rank them to find out what the critical business processes are. So because you don't want to look at the petty cash process, you don't want to look at small processes where there's very little risk to the information. So you're going to rate the processes, and then you're going to look for information assets in those processes. So what is the critical information asset in each of those processes? Then once you've got that, you're scoring the criticality of the information asset based on the value, and we generally use confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So then you score the information asset based on its value in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So you might find there's client data in your billing process, and that client data is the critical information, because if it's changed, lost, or stolen by somebody, or there's an issue related to it, it's going to have a big risk to your company. So you're starting a process of scoring, categorizing, classifying processes and information assets.
So, Mr. Bivin, this is the value you are using, or this is the value is input given by the business owner?
Yeah, that's why exactly that. You cannot do this by yourself. You need to have someone that truly understands that information, and they'll be able to even tell you where that information is stored in that process too, which helps you guiding the controls you're going to need to develop later. So is it inside SAP? Is it in a Excel spreadsheet? Is it stored on someone's hard drive? All those questions will come now when you're busy understanding the information asset.
Okay. And then what is the next step after that? Like, once we identify, we prioritize the criticality of the assets and all that, then what is the next step? Like, how the consultant proceed after identifying these assets and the criticality of the assets?
So once you understand what the assets are, then you do a threat assessment against those assets. So what we do is we look for a list of common information security specific threats, because that's what we're doing here. And then we assess the most relevant threats to that information asset. So what do we need to understand? So you look at the environmental threats, the fires and the floods, but you're obviously looking more at the technical, the hackers, the malware threats, threats related to somebody making a mistake, anything that you need to understand what threats are that are the most relevant to that specific one. And a lot of time, as I mentioned, it's going to be things like hackers breaking in, malware affecting it, but also people sharing information they shouldn't by mistake. So mistakes, people sending out data, as you said, the PR type ones. So you understand the threats and the vulnerabilities related to those threats. You get a score, and then you choose the threats, and then the next step is where you start scoring the threats and start scoring the values in terms of that.
And once we're done with the threat assessments and impact assessment, then what is the next step? Like any challenge we are facing in this threat assessment when as a consultant go for the assessment, like any challenge, any difficulties, or any issues?
There's probably quite a lot that you got to try and unpack, but one of the first that could happen in the threats assessment is sort of an understanding, is teaching the client what the threats are about, teaching the client you don't want to, them to make mistakes, but you also want to tell them what the threats are. So you want to give them enough so that they find the threats by themselves and then that they agree. So you should ideally try and do this with more than one person in the company, get a group together and get them to agree as a group what the threats are. And this is a very good question that you're saying there, because this is where you get the value, because they start to understand the threat to the company and they come up with an agreed value, agreed list of threats that they come up with by themselves. And I've done this before with boards where you get 3 senior guys in a group and you get them to individually come up with threats, come up with the risk values in terms of what that threat is, and then they then sit together and agree them, and they'll argue and they'll debate and they'll come up with a list of threats. So that's quite a big challenge in terms of education sometimes, and making sure that they don't start misunderstanding the difference between threats and vulnerabilities, which is my biggest thing. It's the weaknesses against the threat, and then how that relates to the actual risk. That's the education part that you as a consultant need to understand really well in order to get that message across to a client. And if you do understand it very well, then you can teach clients a lot about risks, and they can actually then start to do that themselves in the future all the time, by themselves, even with guidance later on when they do more risk assessments. So that's probably the first major one I do see.
Okay. But when you're trying to convey the risk details, when you're trying to convey the threat details to the stakeholders, do you face any challenge in terms of make them explain about why we need this control to be addressed, or anything like, because not necessarily every day is a good day for us as a consultant. We might get a great customers. Yeah, we might get a great customers who understand the risk, and there will be some customer who always map the impact with the cost. No matter the cost is basically has a less cost compared to the impact, but they still think, okay, because security is a liability in the company, it is not a business enabler as per them. But in reality, the security is a business enabler. So how you face those challenges, Mr. Bivin?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of times where I've had clients who are not happy with what the scores should be, and they underestimate, and they refuse to actually increase the scores because they don't necessarily understand the real risk to their company. When you try and debate that with them, you get into potentially a fight. So you need to have enough information behind you to justify and explain that risk so that doesn't happen. And that's a pretty important point that you've said there. So keeping calm and explaining a risk in a logical way and getting the client to buy into that is quite important. Also had egos where people think that they know all the right answers and they refuse to yield, where I'm right and you're wrong. I had a client who, the guy was a very well educated risk assessment professional for 10, 20 years, and he was getting confused between threats and vulnerabilities, and he refused to take my opinion into account. So that was, and he actually walked out once, and I had to bring him back in and actually try and calm the guy down. So risk assessment can get very emotional, which is quite an interesting point, as you say.
That's great. So, Mr. Bevan, like after identifying all these details, threats, and vulnerability, then what is the next step? Like how we proceed for the next step? Yeah.
So similar to what you did with the assets, then you score them. So what are our most important threats and vulnerabilities, and
Mm-hmm.
how does it attach itself to a risk? So
Mm-hmm.
if a hacker gets in, what's he going to do? He's going to steal our data, and we've lost our data. What's the risk related to that? And then you score it. So you should have a very good methodology which has a scoring ranking, which can give you value, some sort of financial value, but also a non-financial value to it as well, so that you can score things and then go, all right, so if we were to lose our customer data to a hacker
Mm-hmm.
through a ransomware attack, for example, what would be the actual value of that risk? So
Okay.
scoring and then classifying the risks related to each one of those. So is the malware threat much more than us having a big operational issue by someone bringing us down? Are other risks rated lower or higher? And then you get a sort of a tiering of, you look
Mm-hmm.
at where the highest risks are. And this is where sometimes those really cool heat map type pictures are
Heat
very
map.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're using heat map, you can look to see, and you can show management, look here, that's the risk related to, trying to think of another good threat that could be to a fire. Maybe a fire destroyed our entire building. That's the
Mm-hmm.
threat related to that, and show them where it is on the heat map. So
Wow.
scoring and then showing it in a report so that people can see it clearly is a really good example, really good way of doing this.
So, is the consultant also give a recommendation about whether it need to be mitigate, accept, avoid? Because when we read any certification, when you go for any certification or doing a bookish knowledge, we learn about the risk treatment approach, where we're talking about mitigating,
Yeah.
accepting, avoiding, and so do we really that really works in the real world, like in the industry, Mr. Bevin?
It definitely does, but you guide them, because what we're trying to do with that scoring I showed you about is that in that heat map you'll see all the risks that are in the reds that have to
Mm,
be treated. So
mm,
so then you'll see the risks that can be tolerated and the risks
mm,
that are minor issues that you don't need to worry about. So anything in the
mm,
reds thing, then it's a discussion. All right, what do we need to do to get that lower? How can we get that lower? And you as a consultant can guide them in terms of how that would work, what would
mm,
get that risk down lower,
mhm.
and guide them on what possible controls are you need to put into place. But be
Well,
careful, don't start talking about, solutions and tools necessarily they must buy. Don't try and sell them things.
mm.
That's a fine line sometimes where you actually do that.
So we need
So
to keep it simple.
try and keep yourself neutral. Try and keep yourself in a place
Mm,
where you're helping them, but you're not saying, I've
mm,
got the solution that you should buy. Sometimes, but maybe they know that you've got the solution, they're willing to buy it, but you need them to come to that conclusion, not you
mhm.
necessarily try and sell them something. So,
Okay.
yeah, it's a very good place to advise them and to help them, but to do it in the way that what you think is best for the client.
Wow, that's great. So, so Mr. Bevin, like if someone want to be a consultant, like like the way, because you are an information security manager and consultant also for one of the big four, and you were in that position when information security was new in this world. I don't want to reveal the experience, age, and all that, but when I reviewed your LinkedIn profile, I can see you are you are handling an information security position in that year when the information security itself is a new in the world. So if anyone want to become a risk consultant, or if anyone want to become an information security consultant, what is your advice for them? Like, what knowledge, what can be the path that they can basically follow to become a good consultant?
It's what's interesting is when you're pointing out that I'm old, teasing
No,
you.
no, 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 no.
No,
No,
um,
Vivian. I'm just
no,
sharing I'm just talking about the
I
experience,
don't get
and
I'm
I'm
not so
sorry.
experienced. I'm just teasing myself. Don't worry.
Yeah,
The thing there is that when I had to study, there was almost no information. There was
yeah,
literally, you had to learn consulting from the base, and you had to teach yourself. There was two books you had to read: the CISSP book, and
yeah.
you had to go from there. Now there's almost the opposite problem. There's too much information. So where do
Okay.
you find the right information, and where do you actually get the correct things? A lot of it is very closely connected to each other. So you'll find that things, are written in similar ways. So you need to find something that gets you the right sort of grounding, and learn from there. You can learn a lot from people. You can read, watch a lot of videos. There's a heck of a lot of solutions out there in terms of information. I still believe that the CISSP is really the fundamental grounding for all of us, because you're getting such a nice range of information across all the different areas to help you. And then and the nice thing with the CISSP when it comes out is that it has normally a partner book which talks about the latest technologies, the latest things in terms of where the world is going. So those are very good places to learn about your fundamentals about risk, and then to go and read on specific topics. Go and read about risk. And right now, like I said, you can Google it and look for what those best places are in terms of specific topics that you can find information. ISACA, IC Squared are trusted sources, but there are lots of other ones. I work with the PCB, with the BSI. Try and get a respectable source in terms of it, making sure that you've got the right people. But you can go online, Amazon, and find so many books on risk, and there you look for what people's opinions are in terms of what the best books are. They are expensive. that's
true. That's really true. But do you recommend any books to our subscribers? Like, if they want to upgrade in risk consulting, so any books you would like to suggest which can be useful for them?
A hard question. I actually haven't read a book on risk for a very long time, and I think maybe that's because I've just built up my own knowledge now. I don't recommend a specific one right now. I think you'd have to go and look. There's a lot of good tools out there that can show you how to do risk assessments. There's a nice free methodology called Octave, Allegro, and you can download that and actually understand how information assets work. 27005 is a very good place to read about. It's a risk management standard for ISO, and that's a very good
21,000.
How to do that. 27005, yeah, that's the risk assessment methodology. So definitely look there for information as well. There's lots of brain dumps and things like that people go and read up on information. But try and focus the way you're learning the information. It's probably a very good place to do it. Yeah.
That's great. So Bevan, anything you would like to share on the last pointer of this session with our subscribers, like aspirants who are making their career in consulting or who are already in a consulting? Do you wish to share any last pointers with us?
Yeah, I think information security and cyber security, whatever you want to call it these days, because it is really, they're very closely tied together depending on what definition you look at, is an incredibly exciting field. A lot of people these days are trying to get into security because of the world and what's happened in the world, and they're changing. I see people changing direction from tourism into information security. I get approached all the time from people in terms of getting into these fields. Don't do it for money. Don't do it because you're interested in it, you're passionate in it. That's where I come from. I didn't do it because I thought I'd be a billionaire, although financially it's a very attractive thing at the same time, so there's a good balance there. But do remember that it's a stressful field. It's not as easy as some people think it is, and there's a lot of stress on CISOs and ISOs these days because of what's happening to companies. So that's my first advice: is don't think you're getting into something that's simple and easy and not
Great
stressful.
point.
Yeah, it's very stressful, guys, in some cases, and if you're in a company and you're working as an ISO and you experience a breach, then you're going to learn.
Every day we have a learning. Every day new threats, new risks, new things. So moral of the story is that when it comes to risk consulting or consulting profiles and all that, so can we say like that, you need to be very good with your basics in order to evaluate posture, in order to evaluate the risk, evaluate the context. Basics are very important. Can we say like that, Mr. Bevan?
Definitely. Logic and basics, as you said there. Now you need to have a good grounding of understanding something, but you need to think. You need to think through the scenarios and have a logical approach to this. It's a very critical. Don't just follow what it says in a book, understand logically for the client what could be their pain points, what their business is about. And
That's
we
great.
have been caught out often where we've rated something as a risk that's very high, and we didn't go and speak enough detail to the business, and then it comes up in a report, and then people get very angry. Well, you don't understand our business. How can that be the worst risk? So very good to do a lot of that. Confirming, discussion, logic, very key issues, but the basics and the grounding, as you said, very important.
Excellent. So there is I'm sorry, I'm taking much time, Bevan. I will just take another 5 minutes if you don't mind.
No problem. Maybe
So,
fine.
yeah, sorry, Mr.
Yes.
Bevan. Bevan, actually, there is always a query about a concept called risk appetite and risk tolerance. So, if you can share us some example of risk appetite, risk tolerance, how it works, it would be great.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think it ties in quite nice with what I just said about understanding what business you're talking to and what they're doing. When you're dealing with a company, a young company, a company that are trying to get business and are very aggressive on how they do business, maybe they also have a very agile approach and they're doing development and they've got youngsters and they're getting things done quickly, mobile apps, a lot of the cool stuff out there. You need to understand that risk appetite is totally different to when you're dealing with a big bank. And if you go in there with the same attitude as you do in a big bank to a company like that, you're not going to understand and be able to portray the risk well to them. So that's a key message, is exactly that. That's a challenge that we need to understand, is the risk tolerance of a company like that, the risk tolerance of a retailer, the risk tolerance of a fashion company, risk tolerance all the way through to a big bank are very, very different. And what that needs should be defined beforehand. So the trick you've got to do is say, all right, let's understand your risk tolerance. And then when you do the risk assessment, then that rules are set already. So they're willing to take more risks. That development agile company that I'm using an example. So they can already then answer those risks and deal with them based on the fact that the risk tolerance or appetite is so well defined beforehand. But when you get to the bank, you've got to realize that you've got a lot less to work with. They're not going to take the risks. They're going to be they're understanding the threats to environmental, regulatory, the government, all these risks to them, losing customers and what happens to them if there are issues. So therefore it's defined in a completely different way. So agreeing that up front is probably your first thing, and agreeing up front why. It's like the understanding what that risk appetite is.
Wow. Thanks, Mr. Bevan. And Bevan, thank you so much for this session. And it is really a grateful session. And I myself learned some new pointers, how the risk perspective works in the organization. And I'm sure this video is going to be a great material, or you can say very useful for the upcoming aspirations who want to make a career in risk consulting. But thanks, Bevan, for this session for us. I'm really very happy that you're able to take from a busy schedule, you're able to take the time for this session. Thanks, Mr. Bevan.
Thank you very much. I mean, what you've shown me again is we've only just touched on a small part of it, and it's actually such a big topic that you could probably have multiple sessions on this. I'm sure that's why we have full courses on this.
If Mr. Bevan is okay with that, we will plan more sessions like that in future. If it will be great for us to have you again for the new topics or anything which is related to the risk assessment. If you're okay with that.
Yeah, all good. I'd love to speak to you guys again. Thank you very much.
Great.